If a child remains silent in a room full of people, everyone thinks they are weak. But what if that silence isn't weakness at all, but rather an extremely intelligent defense mechanism that their brain has created to survive emotion? Imagine a 6-year-old child entering a new classroom. She doesn't run, she doesn't speak loudly, she doesn't seek attention. She observes the teacher's tone of voice, the way her classmates group together, who laughs at whom, who is ignored. In a few seconds, she maps the entire environment. Without anyone noticing, her brain has already decided this is safe or this is dangerous. While adults only see shyness, something much deeper is happening. That child is collecting emotional data. They are trying to anticipate rejection, shame, embarrassment. They are trying to avoid pain. And now comes the uncomfortable question. Why do some children do this and others don't? It's not a lack of self-esteem. It's not fussiness. It's not drama. Many shy children are born with a nervous system that is more sensitive to social stimulation, loud noises, changes in routine, direct eye contact, tension in the air. All of this reaches their brains with amplified emotional volume. They feel more, they process more, they think more, but nobody explains this to them. So they grow up hearing phrases like, "You need to loosen up more, stop being so quiet, speak properly, don't be weird." And little by little, something dangerous happens inside that child's mind. She begins to believe that her natural way of existing in the world is a mistake. This is the first invisible micro-trauma of shyness. It's not one big traumatic event. It's a sequence of small moments in which she realizes that the world prefers those who speak loudly, respond quickly, and take up space. She learns to reduce her own emotional volume in order to fit in. She learns to swallow questions so as not to bother anyone. She learns to smile when she wants to cry. And here arises a silent conflict that almost no one notices. On the outside, she seems calm, polite, mature for her age. On the inside, she's in a constant state of emotional vigilance. Every word she thinks of saying goes through an internal filter. Will this sound strange? Will this make me look silly? Will this draw too much attention? This filter is tiring. But the scariest thing is that it becomes automatic. At some point in childhood, a shy child stops trying to speak and starts trying not to make mistakes. This is the exact moment when shyness ceases to be just a personality trait and begins to become part of one's identity. And almost always, nobody notices because she doesn't cause trouble. She doesn't argue. She doesn't yell. She doesn't interrupt. She simply fades away silently within herself. Now think about this. How many children today are being praised for being quiet, when in reality they are learning to hide? How many are being called mature, when in reality they are in emotional self-protection mode? What if what everyone calls shyness is actually an extremely sensitive brain trying to survive in a world that's too noisy? If this is true, then the shy child is not weak. She is a child who learned too early that the world can hurt, and that raises a question that changes everything. What exactly happens inside this child's brain when she goes silent? And why might this mechanism, which is designed to protect her, end up imprisoning her for the rest of her life? A shy child doesn't wake up one day deciding to be afraid of people. They wake up with a brain that perceives everything louder than normal. Sounds, faces, glances, changes in tone of voice, unfamiliar environments. For them, the world doesn't arrive at medium volume. It arrives at maximum volume. Now imagine that child growing up and becoming an adult, a man or woman who enters a work meeting and feels their heart rate even before anyone speaks to them, who mentally rehearses a simple phrase before raising their hand, who feels a knot in their stomach when having to introduce themselves aloud, who arrives home exhausted after a family lunch without understanding why a common conversation drained all their energy. This adult is not weak. He is the same sensitive brain from childhood, only now living in a grown-up body, trying to function in a world that has never quieted down. The brain of a shy person is programmed to detect emotional threats, not physical threats, social threats, rejection, shame, ridicule, exclusion. When you enter a new environment and feel an automatic discomfort, that's not drama. It's the amygdala in your brain triggering an alert. Be careful, this might hurt. For most people, this alarm sounds softly and soon fades away. For those born with heightened emotional sensitivity, it sounds loudly and never completely shuts off. That's why so many shy people live in a state of invisible tension. The woman who seems calm but comes home and cries knowing why. The man who avoids social gatherings and says he prefers to be alone, when in reality he's just tired of fear. The teenager who spends hours thinking about a phrase, the adult who reminisces about conversations from years ago, still feeling ashamed of their own tone of voice. This is not emotional weakness. It is an overactive nervous system trying to protect the person from pain they have learned to expect. And here comes an uncomfortable truth. This sensitive brain isn't born afraid of it learns it. He learns when a child says something innocent and someone laughs. He learns when he tries to participate and is ignored. He learns when he is compared to his extroverted brother. He learns when he hears comments like, "You're strange, you talk too little," or "You need to change." Each tiny episode leaves a microscopic mark. On their own, none of them. Together they reprogram the brain. Shy people grow up believing that social exposure is dangerous. Then she begins to anticipate the suffering. She speaks less than she thinks. "I laughed when I didn't. It's funny." He agrees when he wants to disagree. Avoid conflict even when you are being disrespected. Not because she is submissive, but that's because her brain learned that hiding hurts less than exposing herself. And the cruelest part is that this happens without anyone noticing. This person becomes the model employee, the perfect daughter, the friend who never causes trouble, the overly understanding partner. From the outside, everything seems under control. Internally, she lives in social survival mode, but there's something that almost no one tells that sensitive brain that causes you suffering today is the same one that gives you deep empathy, rare emotional perception, creativity, intuition, and heightened social. The problem was never his sensitivity. The problem was that you learned to use it to hide, instead of using it to express yourself. And that raises a question that changes everything. At what exact point in life did this shyness cease to be merely a personality trait and turn into fear? Because there is a specific point at which something breaks from the inside, and when it breaks, the person never again feels safe being who they are. There's a specific moment in almost every shy person's life when something changes inside. It's not a major trauma, it's not a tragedy, it's something small, seemingly trivial, that goes unnoticed by everyone else, except by the sensitive brain of that. It could be a classroom presentation where she mispronounces a word. It could be a comment from the teacher saying, "Speak louder, nobody's listening to you." It could be a joke about her quiet demeanor within the family. It could be the day she gathers the courage to tell someone something and is ignored. From the outside, nothing more. Inside, the brain registers a simple yet brutal equation. Social exposure generates pain, and when the brain learns this, it never reverts to its original state. But have you ever stopped to think about why this type of event affects some people so deeply and hardly affects others? The difference isn't in the event itself, it's in the sensitivity of the nervous system. For an emotionally sensitive child, shame isn't just discomfort, it's a threat. It's a feeling of social annihilation. It's the whole body going into danger mode. On that day, something new is born within her, an inner observer that begins to monitor everything she does, every word, every gesture, every facial expression. Before she even speaks, she already imagines herself being judged. Before even trying, she already imagines herself failing. Before she even speaks out loud, she already imagines herself ashamed. This is the beginning of social, not as a clinical diagnosis, but as an invisible psychological pattern. And here comes the most disturbing part. Most people don't realize when this happens. The child continues going to school, continues getting good grades, continues being polite, continues being called quiet. From the outside, everything looks normal. Internally, she begins to live in anticipation of the worst case. Do you recognize this in yourself? That feeling of going into a conversation already expecting to say something wrong? That need to rehearse simple phrases in your head? That strange fear of bothering people just by being near them? That's not like your personality. This is the brain trying to avoid old pain. But at what point exactly does shyness turn into fear? It turns into fear when the child stops trying to express themselves and starts trying not to make mistakes. It turns into fear when the focus shifts from curiosity and becomes self-protection. It turns to fear when the internal question changes from what I want to say to what I can say without embarrassing myself. This is the breaking point, and almost no one talks about him. From that point on, the person begins to take shape. He speaks less than he thinks. He shows less than he feels. It positions itself less than it would like. She becomes a miniature version of herself, and the world is starting to reinforce this. She receives praise for being discreet because it doesn't require much work, because it doesn't create conflict. Without realizing it, everyone is rewarding her discipline. But here's the break from the norm. What if your shyness was what if the problem was that you learned too early that being seen is dangerous? Because when that happens, something even deeper begins to form. An identity. The person stops thinking, I'm someone who sometimes gets shy, and you start thinking, that's just how I am. I am quiet. I am strange. I am socially inept. It becomes part of me. And anything that threatens that identity generates panic, public speaking, disagree, show emotion, to be vulnerable. All of this is starting to look like a risk of emotional death. But why do some shy people grow into insecure adults, while others manage to break free? What changes the psychological destiny of a sensitive child? Because there is an invisible factor that decides everything. And when you understand what that factor is, you realize that your story isn't doomed to end the way it began. In fact, you may be much closer to a turning point than you think. If you ask a shy person what they think of them, the answer is almost always laden with guilt. They say they are too inhibited, too sensitive, too strange. They believe they were born with a manufacturing defect. But here's a fact that almost no one talks about. About 20% of the population is born with a neurological trait called high sensitivity. This means that the brain processes emotional and social stimuli more deeply. It's not a disease. It's not a disorder. It's a biological variation. This same trait appears far more frequently than average in artists, writers, therapists, creative scientists, and quiet leaders. Steve Wozniak was extremely shy. Albert Einstein avoided social interaction. Emily Dickinson lived almost in seclusion. Rosa Parks was described as quiet and reserved. None of them were weak. They simply had a type of mind that observes more, feels more, and reflects more. Now imagine a child with such a sensitive brain growing up in a world that idolizes those who speak loudly, assert themselves, and constantly sell themselves. What do you think happens to this child? She learns that her natural way of existing is wrong. She learns that she needs to force herself to be someone else in order to be accepted. She learns that her own sensitivity is a problem, and this creates a silent tragedy because this child grows up using a brain designed for emotional depth, only to survive socially. She becomes the kind of person everyone trusts, but no one listens to. Everyone goes to her to vent, but no one asks how she is doing. Everyone thinks they're strong, but inside they feel invisible. Have you ever noticed how shy people tend to be the most empathetic in the room? They can tell when someone's mood changes. They can sense when the atmosphere is tense. They know when someone is lying about being okay. This is no coincidence. This is the result of years of involuntary training in reading emotional cues to protect oneself. Now comes the unexpected part. Research shows that highly sensitive people tend to have higher levels of social awareness, creativity, and complex thinking. They make connections that other people don't. They see nuances that go unnoticed. The problem was never sensitivity. The problem was that it was used as a shield instead of being used as a tool. Instead of teaching this child to trust her own perception, the world taught her to doubt herself. Instead of teaching her that she could express herself at her own pace, the world taught her that she needed to hide. So she grew up trying to fix her public speaking courses, self-help books, phrases like, get out of your comfort zone. But none of that works because the problem isn't in social skills. It lies in the emotional association between being seen and feeling pain. And here begins a simple yet devastating story. A 38-year-old woman, extremely competent, never asked for a raise, never disagreed with her boss, never spoke in meetings. In therapy, she discovered that at age 7, she raised her hand at school to answer something and got it wrong. The class laughed. The teacher made a joke. Her brain registered this as a rule of life. Public speaking is dangerous. 30 years later, that rule still governed all her decisions. Now think about that. How many decisions in your life today are still being guided by emotional rules you learned as a child? What if what you call shyness is actually enormous potential that you've been taught to hide? If that's true, then the question ceases to be, how do I, and it becomes something much deeper. How do I teach my brain that it's now safe to be who I am? There's a quiet moment in every shy person's life when they begin to suspect that the problem isn't exactly with them. It's when you realize you've already tried to change in 1,000 ways. You've tried to talk more. You've tried to force yourself to be sociable. You've tried to fake confidence. You've tried to fit in. And yet, inside, the feeling of danger when seen remains the same. This happens because the root of deep shyness has never been. It has always been emotional. You're not afraid of people. You're afraid of the pain that your brain has learned to associate with people. His nervous system isn't broken. He's stuck in the past. He still believes you are that child who was ridiculed, ignored, compared, exposed, or he still thinks that speaking up is dangerous, that disagreeing is risky, that drawing attention to yourself is a threat. So it does exactly what it was programmed to do. He protects you, even if it's costing you opportunities, relationships, voice, space, and self-esteem. This is the most important turning point in this whole. You don't need to fix yourself. You need to update your brain. You need to teach your nervous system that you are no longer in that environment, that you are no longer that helpless child, that today you have emotional resources, autonomy, language, and the power of choice. And that doesn't happen with motivational phrases. It happens with new, repeated, and safe emotional experiences. It starts on a micro scale, saying something small in a conversation and realizing that nothing bad happened. Disagreeing with someone calmly and realizing you haven't been. To position yourself on a simple boundary and realize that the world hasn't. Expressing an opinion and realizing that you haven't been socially condemned for it. Each of these experiments rewrites, millimeter by millimeter, the old equation. Social exposure does not cause pain. Social exposure now generates neutrality or even connection. At first, your body will react as if you were in danger. Heart racing, sweat, voltage, the urge to run away. This doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It means you are touching on an old, emotional memory. And here's a truth that almost no one talks about. Emotional courage is not the absence of fear. It's about teaching the body with patience that it can feel fear and still survive the experience. You don't become confident by thinking differently. You become confident by proving to your own nervous system that it no longer needs to hide you. And that changes everything, because when shyness ceases to be an identity and reverts to being merely a transient emotional state, something awakens. Your voice is returning, your presence returns, your healthy anger returns, her spontaneous joy returns, your ability to occupy guilt returns. You begin to realize that you were never weak, you were only sensitive, in a world that didn't know how to care for your sensitivity. And when you understand that, something profoundly liberating happens. The shame begins to fade. Self-criticism begins to diminish. The comparison is starting to lose its appeal. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" And he starts asking, "What happened to me?" This change in questioning heals more than years of trying to force yourself to be someone else. If you recognized yourself in any part of this video, know one thing: you are not alone. Millions of men and women experience this invisible conflict every day, believing they are flawed, when in reality they are simply trapped in an old emotional pattern. There is a way out. There is reconciliation with who you are. There's a much lighter, more spontaneous and whole version of you waiting to emerge on the other side of that fear. If this content resonated with you, if it touched you in a sensitive area, or helped you understand something new about yourself, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and continue this journey with me. And if you feel comfortable, write in the comments a question, a situation from your life, or a moment when you realized you started to hide emotionally. If you prefer, you can write anonymously. I read everything. Thank you for being here, for listening until the end, and for having the courage to look inside. That in itself shows that there is something very strong inside you trying to resurface.